The alarm didn't sound when Vex Aren disobeyed the oldest order in the archives. She had expected an alarm. She had expected a security lockdown, a pulsing red screen, some sign that the universe had noticed what she was doing. She had expected, at the very least, that the terminal would resist, that it would produce some symbolic friction before giving in to her reckless curiosity. Instead, the file simply opened, silent and obedient, as if it had waited 800 years for someone willing to ask. Meridian 9 Station was a place designed to be forgotten. Situated at the far reaches of the western spiral arm, at a distance that made any inspection visit a costly and inconvenient bureaucratic exercise, it had become, over the decades, the final destination for everything the Galactic Administration considered technically obligated to preserve, but practically committed to never consulting. 3-century-old exploration logs, surveys of dead stars, maps of regions reclassified as exclusion zones for reasons that the most recent documents described only as long-standing maximum security considerations. It was exactly the kind of place where a four-eyed academic belonging to the Leth-Varan species and adapted to working in environments with luminosity below 40 lux could spend a 12-month internship without anyone in the galaxy caring in the slightest about what she was reading. Vex Aren had accepted the post because she needed credits to finish her doctorate in digital archaeology, and because the solitude of deep space was, to her, preferable to the constant noise of the central stations. Her species had evolved in crystal caves, where silence was productive and darkness was information. A dead archive with 300 terabytes of obsolete data was, from a certain perspective, the ideal environment. For the first 4 months, she had performed her duties with mechanical efficiency, cataloging, compressing, and transferring to the central database. The work was tedious in the specific way it is tedious to digitize the same type of thing thousands of times, with enough variations to prevent the mind from entering full power-saving mode, but not enough to make any individual file interesting. Surveys of rocky systems without atmospheres, analyses of interstellar dust clouds, records of mapping drones that had lost propulsion 200 years ago and were never recovered because the cost didn't justify the operation. The file that changed everything had been in the middle of a batch labeled Series 7, Exploration Data, Cycle 3, 089, Pending Transfer. Vex Aren had processed 72 files from that batch before reaching it. The name was different from the others. It didn't follow the automatic naming convention the systems used for cataloging. Someone had named it manually. Original Survey Prime, Do Not Transfer, Do Not Copy, Do Not Read. She had read it 3 times, trying to decide if those words were an instruction or a description. The administration's classification system had 14 restriction categories, with precise protocols for each one. None of them included the phrase "do not read," which was simultaneously more direct and stranger than any official language she had encountered up to that point. It was almost, she thought, as if it had been written by someone in a hurry, with no time to follow the proper protocol. The most sensible instruction would be to mark the file as special review material and send a form to the administration's compliance office, which would probably reply sometime between 3 weeks and never. That was clearly the correct professional option for an intern without top-tier security clearance. Vex Aren opened the file. What appeared on the screen was not an ordinary survey log. It was a map. And it was detailed in a way that made every other map she had processed look like a child's sketch. Hundreds of star systems with coordinates precise to the 10th of an astronomical unit. Atmospheric composition analyses of planets that didn't appear in any atlas she had ever consulted. Resource data, abundant liquid water, nickel, iron, silicon, carbon in concentrations that would cause any mining corporation to collapse in euphoria. Population estimates noted next to each inhabited system, with update dates ranging from 812 years ago to, disturbingly, just 300 years prior. In the center of the map where all official atlases showed a gray area labeled only as uncharted region, there was a galaxy within the galaxy, 237 cataloged systems, with star names, planet designations, and an annotation in a smaller font that Vex Aren had to tilt all 4 eyes forward to read properly. Human space, policed, inner frontier. Contact protocol suspended by council order. Unanimous decision, year 3, 3999, GE reason archived under maximum seal. Vex Aren stared at the words for a time she later couldn't accurately estimate. The station's air conditioning system produced a low-frequency hum she normally didn't hear, but at that moment, it seemed deafening. Humans. The word existed, she knew, in scattered historical records, in cross-references of exploration documents from the early period of galactic expansion, in a few academic texts dealing with first contact alongside a dozen different species. They were the benchmark species that appeared and disappeared, present in some files and absent in others, having been, up to that moment, background noise so consistent she had never stopped to ask why the signal was so fragmented. She initiated a search in the uncompressed historical logs, the ones that hadn't yet gone through the transfer process, and therefore still contained their original metadata intact. It took the terminal 12 minutes to locate what she was looking for, a folder labeled First Contact, designated species H001, archived for internal review, dated 3,398 years of the Galactic Era calendar, 1 year before the Council's decision. The First Contact logs were enthusiastic, written with that mix of scientific caution and genuine wonder that Vex Aren had learned to recognize in legitimate exploration documents. Species H001 had been found in an early stage of technological civilization, utilizing chemical propulsion and electromagnetic communication, but demonstrated a capacity for learning and adaptation that the explorers considered exceptional even for species in an equivalent phase of development. The first data exchanges had been, according to the report of Primary Envoy Kelsotha, warm and promising. And then the next file in the chronological sequence was dated 4 months later and was simply titled Isolation Protocol, Immediate Implementation. There was no document between the two explaining what had happened, no meeting minutes, no risk analysis, no formal justification other than a single paragraph that stated in dense administrative language. Upon comprehensive evaluation of the data collected during the initial contact period, the Council has determined that the best approach to ensuring the stability of the galactic order consists of indefinitely suspending any further contact and removing the region designated as human space from official navigation maps until further deliberation. Vex Aren looked at the terminal, then at the small reinforced quartz window to her right that showed outer space, dark, static, dotted with stars. Somewhere beyond those stars, in a region the official maps insisted on depicting as a blank void, there was an entire civilization that the galaxy had decided 800 years ago to pretend didn't exist. She copied the file to her personal drive. The instruction said do not copy, but that seemed secondary now, in the face of everything else. The terminal didn't protest. The silence of Meridian 9 Station remained the same as before, dense and indifferent, as if the universe truly hadn't noticed. But Vex Aren had noticed, and that, she already felt, would change everything. Part 2. The diplomat Vex Aren's contact with the veteran diplomat began, like many important things in her life, by accident. She had sent a discreet query to the Galactic Administration's retired personnel database, looking for any former official who had served on the Western frontier before the archives were sealed. The search returned 41 names, of which 39 had passed away. One had entered voluntary seclusion in an orbital monastery on Keth Savar, and one still showed an active address. Sela Morwen Doth, former senior envoy of the Third Degree, currently registered as a permanent resident of Corsair Station, on the outer edge of the Valanthe system. Corsair Station was not the kind of place where high-ranking veteran diplomats normally ended their careers. It was a mid-sized refueling platform, designed to service minor trade routes that the larger transport operators deemed not profitable enough to cover regularly. It had the specific reputation of being the destination for people who needed an official address but preferred that no one looked for them too often. Vex Arin had sent a formal message, expecting no reply. She received an answer in 40 minutes, which simply read, "Come in person. Do not use administration communication channels for this matter." The journey took 9 days. Vex Arin used accumulated medical leave to justify her absence from Meridian 9, leaving the transfer processes on autopilot, and boarded a series of transit connections that took her progressively further away from the main traffic hubs. There was something almost archaeological about the experience, each jump outward revealing older and less polished versions of galactic infrastructure, like geological layers growing rougher the deeper she dug. Sela Morwen Dath was 240 years old, which placed her, by her species standards, at an age comparable to an 80-year-old human, though Vex Arin wouldn't know that at the time they met. The envoy belonged to the Dathsoren, a slow metabolism species with long lives and even longer memories, who had produced a disproportionate percentage of the most capable diplomats the administration had ever employed. She had the tired, precise look of someone who had seen a lot and had learned to no longer be surprised by any of it, except, as Vex Arin would discover, by the recurring ability of the young to reach conclusions the elders had deliberately decided to avoid. They met in a private meeting module that Sela had apparently rented permanently, a small room with 2 chairs, a table, and a window displaying the hydrogen gas nebula that made the Valanthi system visually interesting and navigationally inconvenient. Sela held a cup of something steaming in her hand, which Vex Arin would only later identify as Dathsoren root tea, and was reading a physically printed document, which was unusual enough to cause an involuntary pause upon entering. "You found the original Survey Prime," Sela said without looking up. It wasn't a question. Vex Arin said yes. She asked how Sela knew. Sela finally looked at her. "Because I put it there," the envoy said. 32 years ago, when I realized the administration had reached the point of no longer knowing why the directive existed, only that it did. I wanted someone to find it. It just took longer than I expected. What followed was the longest and most disturbing conversation Vex Arin had experienced in her entire academic life, and she had defended a dissertation on the phenomenology of collective memory in post-extinction civilizations. Sela had served on the Western frontier 200 years prior. As part of a remote monitoring mission, the administration discreetly maintained to verify the isolation protocol remained intact. It was long-distance observation work, no contact, no detectable transmissions, pure passive surveillance of the signals that naturally leaked from human space and that, with the right equipment and enough patience, could be interpreted. What Sela had monitored, over 4 years on the frontier, was a civilization that didn't know it was being watched and, consequently, had no reason to perform as anything other than what it truly was. "The first thing," Sela said, "that you need to understand is what happened to Admiral Krethonvar's fleet." Vex Arin knew the name from an oblique reference in one of the documents she had reviewed. A fleet. An incursion. No details. Sela placed her cup on the table and stared out at the hydrogen nebula through the window for a moment. 800 years ago, she said, 10 years after the isolation protocol was established, the Veth Akra Military Confederation decided that the newly blocked region on the official maps was an opportunity. 4,000 warships, the largest unified fleet that Confederation had produced up to that point. Human space, by all available surveys, was technologically generations behind. It was, in military parlance, a soft target. Vex Arin waited. 1,873 ships came back, Sella said. The humans didn't have comparable weaponry. They didn't have equivalent shield technology. They had nothing in terms of hardware that should have made the battle so costly for the invading fleet. But the humans didn't retreat. That was the first thing Crethon Var reported, with a mix of perplexity and something analysts would later interpret as the beginning of a very specific kind of fear. Every system the fleet took, the humans counterattacked. With fewer resources, with losses that mathematically should have forced a calculated capitulation, they kept fighting. Not irrationally, not suicidally, but with a persistence that the Confederation's tactical models simply couldn't predict. The fleet advanced for 7 months. They took 14 systems. They lost 380 ships, an attrition rate that already exceeded any cost-benefit projection that had justified the operation. Military analysts sent messages recommending a strategic reassessment. Crethon Var ignored them. There was a logic, recognizable to any commander on a prolonged campaign, that said retreating now meant all previous losses had been in vain. The humans understood that logic too. They waited. In the 10th month, the fleet was at its deepest penetration point in human space, having taken 22 systems, having lost 1,133 ships. Crethon Var sent a message to the Confederation saying the resistance was nearly broken. That night, the humans counterattacked on 17 simultaneous fronts. Vex Aren realized she had leaned all 4 eyes forward, which was, for her species, the equivalent of sitting on the edge of her seat. They had been retreating strategically, Sela said, yielding space to concentrate force. Every system they surrendered was calculated to overextend the fleet's supply lines, to disperse their strength, to create vulnerable flanks. They didn't have superior technology, but they had something Crethon Var's tactical models couldn't properly quantify, a tolerance for cost that had no visible limit, combined with a capacity for multi-front coordination that presupposed a mutual trust between commanders that no fleet of that size had ever demonstrated before. Crethon Var's fleet wasn't destroyed. It was dismantled, system by system, over the following 3 months, until what remained made the decision that any rational organization makes when the cost exceeds any conceivable benefit. They asked to stop. The note was delivered by a human messenger on physical paper, handwritten. Vex Aryan had seen the reference to the paper in the Meridian 9 file, but had interpreted it as a quaint detail. Sela pulled a small card from inside the printed document she had been reading when Vex Aryan arrived and placed it on the table between them. It was a reproduction. The words were translated into Veth Akra, but Sela said the original language had been preserved in the sealed archives. Please don't do this again. Vex Aryan stared at the card. It wasn't a threat, Sela said. There was no irony. The linguistic analysts who eventually saw the original confirmed it. It was a genuine request. The humans had defeated the largest military fleet the Veth Akra Confederation had ever assembled, with losses that would send any species into recovery mode for a generation, and all they wanted was simply for it not to happen again. That, Vex Achrin said slowly, is what scared the Council. Sela took her cup back. Not their ability to fight, she said. Their inability to give up. Any species strong enough can decide to stop fighting when the cost is too high. Humans didn't calculate cost the same way. And a variable that doesn't calculate cost in the expected way is the hardest variable to model in any system of galactic order. Vex Aryan thought about the mapping data she had copied, about the populated systems, the resource analyses, the update dates that reached up to 300 years ago. They know they are isolated, she said. It wasn't a question. Sela nodded. They have for 300 years. They figured it out on their own, eventually. And do you want to know what they did when they found out? They kept working, Vex Aryan said, intuiting the answer before it arrived. They kept working, Sela confirmed. with a note added to some of their internal navigation documents, which my monitors managed to capture and translate. It essentially said, "The neighbors don't seem to want contact at the moment. Respect it. Check back periodically." They sat in silence for a while. The hydrogen nebula of the Valanthi system continued its slow, indifferent drift. "There's more," Sela said finally. "The economic embargo, the rescued ships, the returned drones. I will show you everything. But first you need to understand one thing, because it's what will make the rest comprehensible." Vex Aren waited. "Humans aren't frightening because they are violent," Sela said. "They are frightening because they are consistent. Any species can have a bad day, a bad century, a bad millennium. Humans seem constitutionally incapable of experiencing a final defeat. And the galaxy, for 800 years, never knew what to do with a variable like that, so it chose not to look at it." Vex Aren thought of the 72 files she had processed before finding the original survey, of how much else was buried in the pending transfer series, waiting for someone willing to disobey a warning. "I need to see everything," she said. Sela nodded, as if she had expected exactly that answer. "I know," the diplomat said. "That's why I left the file there." Part 3. The Arrival. The docking request arrived at 04:17 Standard Station Time, when the graveyard shift of Nexus Central's traffic control was at its lowest point of collective attention. Controller Zeph Orvan had spent the last 3 hours processing route updates for synthetic grain transports and authorizing refueling maneuvers for a fleet of freighters. It required precisely enough intellectual interaction to keep its operator awake, but not the level required to keep its operator truly present. When the docking request flashed on the screen, his first thought was that there was a coding error in the system, because the ship's identification field was filled with a symbol he didn't recognize, and the origin field was simply blank. His second read revealed that the ship had provided origin coordinates, yes, but those coordinates corresponded to a region the official Nexus Central Navigation Atlas labeled as Uncharted Sector Gray Class, which was administrative parlance for a region that hadn't been visited in measurable time by any registered ship, and whose navigation data was considered insufficient to recommend entry. Zeph Orvan activated the verification protocol and sent a standard identification query. The response arrived in 43 seconds, which was, he noted, just enough time for the ship to have received the signal, processed it, and replied, implying a position much closer than the lack of identification had suggested. The reply stated, "In standard galactic interlingua with some slightly unusual grammatical constructs, independent exploration vessel, persistent horizon, origin Sol system, western arm. Requesting permission to dock at airlock 7. We have goods for trade and would like to speak with someone in charge. Please." The please was underlined. Zeph Orvan didn't know if this was a cultural convention or deliberate emphasis. He escalated the alert to the shift supervisor, who escalated it to the director of operations, who escalated it to the on-duty security representative, who escalated it to the station's board of directors. This resulted in an emergency meeting at 05. Aero 3, with 12 individuals extremely dissatisfied with their sleep schedules. The decision to permit the docking was taken with reluctant unanimity, based on the principle that refusing to dock a ship that had said, "please," and had identified itself voluntarily was diplomatically more complicated than simply letting the ship dock and seeing what happened. The persistent horizon locked into airlock 7 at 06:41, and the coupling process took 4 minutes longer than standard. The station's technicians would later attribute this to the fact that the ship's docking system was compatible with the station's, but had been built differently enough to require a manual adjustment sequence. One of the technicians noted in his report that it looked as if someone had read the standard docking technical specs and then rebuilt it from scratch using first principles, arriving at something that worked perfectly well but clearly hadn't been copied from any existing model. Nexus Central's reception delegation consisted of 6 individuals: Operations Director Cam Vethros, 2 security agents in non-confrontation uniforms, a credentialed translator, an on-call doctor specializing in the biochemistry of unknown species, and a board representative named Assessor Plin Tahara, chosen specifically for her documented history of maintaining composure in unusual situations. They stood in the corridor of Airlock 7 for 6 minutes after the pressurization chime confirmed the airlock had equalized. The doctor checked the pathogen detector 3 times. Assessor Plin Tahara adjusted her official identification sash twice. Nobody said anything. The inner hatch of the persistent horizon opened with a satisfying mechanical clunk, the kind of sound that indicates a well-built seal operating within specifications. Commander James Sterling stepped out of the ship, holding a silver-colored metal thermal mug with a visible weld mark on the right side. He wore a synthetic fiber work jacket with patches on both elbows and an insignia on his left shoulder that the translator would later identify as a stylized representation of a solar system with 9 planets, one of which had apparently been the subject of significant taxonomic debate at some point in that species' history. The commander was of average height, with fair skin, neatly trimmed graying hair, and the posture of someone who had spent many years in variable gravity environments and developed a way of distributing his weight that worked in any configuration. Analysts would later estimate his biological age at roughly 50 years old, which, given human life expectancy, placed him in his prime productive maturity. He looked at the reception delegation with an expression Plin Tahara would describe in her official report as warm and directly evaluative, and said something the translator processed with a 0. 8-second latency before converting. "Hello? Sorry for dropping in without more notice. We were in the area." We were in the area. Plin Tahara logged the phrase in her memory for later analysis. Because the persistent horizon had come from a region 42 light-years away from Nexus Central, and in most known galactic vocabularies, in the area implied a considerably shorter distance. Director Cam Vethros stepped forward and delivered the official Nexus Central Protocol greeting for visitors of unregistered provenance. It consisted of 27 words and had been written by a linguistic committee 300 years prior to be simultaneously cordial, neutral, and non-committal regarding any implicit political affirmations. Commander Sterling listened to the translation, nodded in a way that seemed to genuinely appreciate the effort, and replied, "Thank you. You can call me James. We brought some things to see if there's any interest in trade, and if anyone has the time, I'd really like to chat. It's been a while since we talked to anyone from the outside." The "it's been a while" was translated by the system as approximately 300 years, which produced exactly 4 seconds of absolute silence among the reception delegation. It was Assessor Plin Tahara who found her voice first. She said, maintaining formal protocol, "We are honored by your visit, Commander Sterling. There is much to discuss." The commander smiled at her. It was a smile she would later describe as the type someone produces when they are genuinely pleased with how a situation is developing, not the calculated diplomatic smile she had learned to read over 20 years of service, but something more direct and harder to categorize. "Great," he said. "Can I grab someone to look at a water filtration system in the meantime? I noticed Airlock 7 has an issue with its return pipe. Takes about 30 minutes. Plin Tahara had not noticed an issue with Airlock 7's return pipe. She discreetly checked with the maintenance technician via encrypted message while guiding the commander down the corridor. The technician confirmed there was a water filtration problem in that section that had been sitting on the deferred maintenance list for 3 weeks because the cost of parts was pending budgetary approval. By 08:15, while the reception delegation was still in the process of determining which conference room the initial meeting should take place in, which board representative should be summoned, and what exact protocol applied to a situation for which no protocol had ever been written, the chief engineer of the persistent horizon, a young human who had been introduced as Harper Smith, bearing the practical, slightly distracted look of someone solving engineering problems even when doing other things, had located the access to Airlock 7's return pipe. She politely requested a set of basic hydraulic pressure tools from a local tech and went to work. She fixed the problem in 22 minutes. The local technician, who had stood watching with the expression of someone simultaneously learning a technique they didn't know and feeling slightly embarrassed by it, confirmed the system was operating within normal specifications for the first time in a month. Harper Smith handed the tools back, said thanks, and went to find Commander Sterling. In the executive deck conference room, Commander Sterling had sat on one side of the table and placed the contents of his thermal mug on it, which turned out to be coffee, a high-caffeine stimulant beverage brewed from beans grown on a planet in the Sol system, and had politely offered it to everyone present. The on-call doctor discreetly ran a portable scanner and transmitted a private message to everyone in the room, noting that the caffeine concentration in that beverage was sufficient to produce severe cardiac events in at least 3 of the 4 species present. The commander, when this was explained to him in diplomatically indirect terms, simply said, "Oh, right, sorry, that happens a lot," and put the mug away without taking any offense. The goods for trade, as Plintahara Protocol boundly phrased it, were eventually revealed to be a data chip containing detailed mappings of 94 star systems on the borders of human space, resource analyses with recent update data, and a set of 12 engineering solutions for common station maintenance issues that the commander described as the most recurrent ones we saw on our travels. In exchange, he wanted information on current galactic trade routes and a species catalog with recommended contact protocols. "Why do you want contact protocols?" asked Plintahara. "So we don't mess up when we go talk to the others," Commander Sterling said. He wore the sincere expression of someone who had learned from past experience to ask questions before assuming he knew how things worked. Plintahara stared at him for a long moment. In 20 years of diplomatic duty, she had learned that most first meetings with new interlocutors involved some level of strategic posturing, evaluation of relative strength, and language constructed to communicate more than it literally said. It was the universal grammar of galactic diplomacy. Commander Sterling wasn't doing any of that. He was simply talking to her, with the direct attention and genuine interest of someone who had traveled very far to speak to another person and saw no reason to make the process more complicated than it needed to be. She realized, with a clarity that surprised her by its speed, that she had no trained protocol for this specific situation, and that this, against all expectations, felt completely acceptable. "Let us discuss the terms," she said. "Great," James Sterling replied, and took a sip of his coffee. Part 4. The Council. Vex Aaron arrived at Nexus Central 36 hours after the persistent Horizon docked, which was exactly the time needed for news of the unknown ship to spread across all the station's communication channels and for the local board of directors to convene, with maximum urgency, an extraordinary session of the Galactic High Council featuring high-volume holographic participation from all permanent seats. She learned all of this in the disembarkation line, reading updates on her portable terminal with the growing sensation that the universe had decided, for some reason, she was still trying to grasp, to make everything happen all at once. Sela Morwen Dath had traveled with her. The veteran diplomat had stated, when Vex Aaron mentioned she intended to go directly to the High Council headquarters with her findings, that someone with authority would need to confirm the origin and authenticity of the files, and that she was the only living person with the relevant credentials to do so in a way the Council couldn't simply ignore. She had said it with the tone of someone making a practical observation, not volunteering for something emotionally significant. But Vex Aaron had noticed Sela packed her travel bag in under 10 minutes, suggesting that a part of her had been waiting for exactly this opportunity for a long time. Nexus Central was the largest permanently inhabited structure in the galaxy, a station that had grown over 400 years of successive expansions into less of a facility and more of a city in space. It housed 3 million permanent residents and a transit flow that, on normal days, processed 40,000 arrivals and departures. It possessed the specific quality of very large, very old places, an overlapping of architectural styles, cultures, and purposes that created a kind of visible historical density on the walls, floors, and signage printed in 42 different languages. The High Council's audience chamber was in the station's central core, in a ring separated from the commercial and residential areas by 3 layers of security and a tradition of formality that had solidified over centuries into something almost indistinguishable from the architecture itself. It was a room designed to project authority, with seats arranged in a semicircle around a central platform and acoustics that made any voice addressing the floor sound far more substantial than it probably was. The presiding counselor was a third-generation Veth Akra named Magistrate Torvan Sek. He had served on the High Council for 40 years and possessed the specific ability, honed over 4 decades of difficult sessions, of appearing simultaneously in absolute control and profoundly irritated without either state interfering with the other. When Vex Aren and Sela were introduced to the session, he was presiding over a debate that had already lasted 8 hours regarding the exact protocol that applied to the Persistent Horizon's presence at Airlock 7. Vex Aren had requested floor time through formal channels, the correct procedure, which normally resulted in a hearing date set between 3 weeks and 3 months in the future. The request had been approved in 40 minutes, which she correctly interpreted as an indication that the council was sufficiently disoriented by the situation to want any additional information available. She presented the Meridian 9 files in chronological order, with Sela confirming the provenance and authenticity of each document as it appeared on the central screen. It took 2 hours. The floor fell into a silence of a kind Vex Aren had never experienced before. The silence of a large group of people processing information that completely contradicts a premise they had assumed to be stable. The final document she presented was Admiral Krethon Var's note. The enlarged reproduction on the central panel displayed those handwritten words in ancient Veth Akra. "Please don't do this again." Magistrate Torvan Sek stared at the note for a long time. Then he looked at Sela. "You are certain of its authenticity," he said. It wasn't a question about the documents. It was a question about whether Sela was willing to put her reputation behind them in a formal, permanent manner. Sela said yes. The silence that followed possessed a different texture. It was the silence of a decision being formed. It was Counselor Brak Vethun, representative of a fast metabolism species that rarely stayed quiet for more than 30 seconds, who broke the impasse by asking the question everyone in the room was avoiding. "If the records are authentic," he said, "and if the humans knew of the isolation 300 years ago and chose not to force contact, then what exactly are we protecting by maintaining the directive?" No one answered immediately. Vex Aren understood in that moment that the question was harder than it seemed, because the honest answer was nothing anymore. The directive had been created out of fear of an unpredictable variable and had been maintained by inertia, and the fact that removing it would require publicly explaining why it had been created in the first place. Every generation of counselors had inherited the directive alongside a culture of not questioning very old directives, which tend to have become old precisely because they survived many rounds of questioning and, therefore, must have some reason for existing. But the reason for this specific directive's existence was that humans were unpredictable. And Commander Sterling's presence at Nexus Central had demonstrated in a rather concrete way that human unpredictability manifested itself in fixing water filtration systems without being asked. Magistrate Torvan Sek requested that Commander Sterling be invited to the plenary session. James Sterling arrived accompanied by Assessor Plin Tahara, who had spent the last 36 hours in his company and wore the look of someone who had slept very little and learned a great deal. The commander had swapped his patched work jacket for a slightly more formal uniform, which still bore the solar system insignia on the shoulder but was clearly ironed. Vex Aren interpreted this as a sign he understood the occasion called for some presentational effort, but did not equate presentational effort with uniformity to local standards. He sat in the chair on the central platform and looked at the semicircle of counselors with the same direct, evaluative attention Plin Tahara had described in her report. Magistrate Torvan Sek stated, in carefully formal language, that the council had become aware of historical circumstances regarding the isolation of human space, and that they would like to hear the commander's perspective on the relationship between his civilization and the broader galactic community. James Sterling considered the question for a few seconds. Then he said, "Well, from our side, the situation looks like this. We discovered the isolation about 300 years ago, when our astronomers noticed navigation patterns that made no sense without some kind of intentional perimeter around our space. We spent some time trying to figure out why. We didn't reach a definitive conclusion, but the most popular theory is that we did something that spooked someone during the early contact years, and the response was to establish distance." He paused. "Most of us figured that forcing contact would probably be counterproductive," he continued. "If someone wants distance, pushing it isn't a great strategy. So we just kept doing what we were doing. We expanded, built, tried to solve our own problems. But the younger generations were starting to grow up without any context as to why the perimeter existed, which is dangerous in a different way, because eventually someone decides to investigate on their own without any of the protocols the elders had set up." Counselor Brack Vethun asked, "And is that why you came?" "Basically," Sterling said. "Also, to be honest, we were curious. 300 years is a long time to stare at a border without knowing what's on the other side." Magistrate Torvan Sek spoke with the precision of someone reaching the pivot point of a very important negotiation. "And what do you expect to happen now?" Sterling tilted his head slightly. "Honestly, a conversation. Trade if there's interest. Maybe some joint projects, if something comes up that makes sense for both sides. We don't have demands. We just think it'd be a shame to keep being represented by a gray area on the map when there are clearly folks here who know we exist." Vex Aren, from where she sat on the margins of the floor, saw the exact moment Magistrate Torvan Sek made his decision. It was hard to describe accurately. Something in his posture, in the way his eyes darted briefly to the document still open on the central screen, and then back to the commander. It was the movement of someone who had weighed 800 years of a directive against the weight of what sat in front of him, and concluded that the two simply did not compare. He consulted the other counselors via private transmission for 4.5 minutes. Then he announced that the Galactic High Council would call for a full review session of Isolation Directive H0Y1 for the following week, with a view toward its formal revocation, and that the presence of Commander Sterling and human representatives would be welcomed at that session as part of the process. Sterling nodded. He said he would need to call a few more people, because decisions of this magnitude weren't something a single ship commander could make alone. "And there's someone else who should be in that conversation," he said, looking directly at Vex Aren with the expression of someone who had been briefed by Plin Tahara on exactly what the academic had done to get them there. "The researcher who found the file. It seems only fair she be a part of what comes next." Vex Aren felt all four of her eyes blink in an involuntary sequence, the Leth Varan equivalent of stumbling in surprise. Magistrate Torvan Sek looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Researcher Vex Aren is formally invited," he stated, with a specific inflection that she realized was the closest the High Council's formal protocol ever got to acknowledging that someone had done a very important thing in a technically irregular manner, and that this was, retroactively, being accepted as valid. She nodded. She said she would be there. Across the room, Sela Morwendath was staring at the central screen where the historical documents were still open. Wearing an expression Vex Aren could only later describe as the look of someone who had waited a very long time for something that was finally happening, and was still trying to believe it was real. Part 5. The aftermath. The human delegates arrived in 3 ships, which was technically 4 fewer than the Galactic Administration's diplomatic representation protocol recommended for a maximum-level directive review session. But no one at Nexus Central was in a position to complain about protocol details when the subject at hand was a directive whose very creation protocol had been violated 800 years prior. Dr. Evelyn Hayes arrived on the first ship, serving as head of the delegation by title. She was a woman in her early 60s with closely cropped white hair and a way of moving that suggested someone accustomed to zero-error tolerance environments. She was a career diplomat, specialized in protracted negotiations, and had been chosen, as Commander Sterling explained to Plyn Tahara with a bluntness that still surprised her, because she's the best we have at not losing her temper when things get slow and complicated. Chief Engineer Arthur Pendleton arrived on the second ship, alongside a team of 4 technicians carrying equipment in cases organized with the specific precision of people who do this frequently and know exactly where everything needs to be for rapid access. Pendleton had the patient, slightly absent-minded look of an engineer constantly solving an internal problem, and who would emerge from that process with a solution probably no one had asked for, but that definitely needed to be implemented. The third ship brought 6 more people introduced with various functions: a computational linguistics specialist, a historian, 2 economists, an exobiologist doctor, and a 20-something woman named Mia Walker, who was described simply as a systems analyst. In the first few hours of her arrival, however, Mia demonstrated an ability to process data from multiple sources simultaneously that prompted Nexus Central's analytics staff to discreetly ask where she had studied. She had studied at a university in a city called Cambridge, on the planet Earth, and had graduated 3 years ago. She said this without any special inflection, as if there were nothing particularly remarkable about the sequence of events that led a recent graduate from a technically isolated planet to become part of the first official human diplomatic delegation in history. When someone pointed this out to her, she shrugged and said she was the only one in the office who didn't have anything booked that week. The formal review session began on the morning of the 7th day after the Persistent Horizon's arrival in a deliberation chamber that had been expanded specifically to accommodate the human delegation alongside the Permanent Council representatives. There were also observing representatives from 18 species who had requested attendance, some out of diplomatic curiosity, some out of commercial interest, and at least 2, Vex Aren suspected, because they needed to see it with their own eyes to believe it was actually happening. Sela Morwendath sat next to Vex Aren in the invited experts section. The veteran diplomat had worn her official service uniform for the first time in decades, a fact Vex Aren knew because Sela had mentioned in passing that she had needed to track down where she'd stored it, which took longer than any other part of her preparations. Dr. Hayes opened the session with a statement that was, by all diplomatic standards Vex Aren knew, remarkably direct. She stated that humanity had not come to negotiate the end of their isolation as if it were a concession to be won. They had come because the isolation had been decided without consultation and maintained without transparently documented justification, and because it wasn't the sort of situation an adult civilization could reasonably continue to accept in indefinite silence. That being said, humanity was genuinely interested in a productive relationship with the galactic community and had brought substantial documentation of what they could contribute to such a relationship. Magistrate Torvan Sek listened to this with the expression of someone cataloging every word for later analysis, and then stated that the council was equally committed to a positive resolution, and the session could proceed. What followed over the first 3 days was a meticulous review of the historical files Vex Aren had compiled, with each document formally authenticated and entered into the official record. Hour by hour, the history the galaxy had deliberately forgotten became more concrete, more undeniable, harder to categorize as a reasonable precaution, and harder not to categorize as an error of considerable proportions. The point of highest tension arrived on the third day, when Counselor Vrath Gnome, representative of a militarily conservative species and one of the most consistent supporters of maintaining the directive over the last 2 generations, asked the question that had been underlying the entire discussion from the start. The historical records show that humanity has demonstrated, in multiple contexts, a capacity for resistance that exceeds any known galactic standard, he said. The question the Council cannot ignore is, what prevents this capacity from eventually being directed in a manner that poses a threat to the established order? The room went silent. It was the direct articulation of the original fear. The fear that had created the directive. The fear that had survived 800 years because it had never been fully answered. Dr. Hayes considered the question for a few seconds. Then she said, "The same thing that prevents any civilization from directing its capabilities in a destructive manner, namely, that it creates more problems than it solves, and we have enough problems without creating more. But I understand that answer may not be satisfactory as a formal guarantee." She paused. "So, I will add this. Humanity has a long history of internal conflict. Wars between nations, between systems, sometimes between colonies. We are not a species that has solved violence, but we have a very consistent correlation. When there is enough work to do and sufficiently interesting problems to solve, the incidence of conflict drops measurably. And looking at what I've seen of this station over the last few days, there is enough work here to keep humanity busy for a very long time." It was an honest answer, not a promise. Vex Aren saw several counselors logging it and registering it exactly because of its honesty. It was at that point that Engineer Pendleton stood up, asked the floor for permission, and said there was something practical he would like to present, if allowed. Permission was granted, partly out of curiosity. Pendleton projected an infrastructure map of Nexus Central onto the central screen, with red dots indicating system failures registered over the last 6 months. There were 73 dots. He explained, with the quiet precision of someone who had done the math and was merely communicating the results, that his team had identified, over 2 days of analysis, solutions for 41 of those problems. They used materials available on the station and methods he described as standard, but which the local technicians confirmed, when discreetly consulted by Mia Walker, were not part of any maintenance protocols they knew. "I'm not saying we're better engineers," Pendleton said, with a bluntness that had the specific effect of making the statement sound like fact rather than arrogance. "I'm saying we have different approaches, and different approaches frequently solve problems that standard approaches leave stagnant, and that works both ways. There are things you do that we don't, and probably should." Counselor Vrath Gnome stared at the map for a long moment. Then he asked, "How many of the 41 could you solve this week?" Pendleton said, "All of them." And so it was. Over the following 2 days of formal deliberations, while the counselors debated language and precedent and long-term implications, Pendleton's technical team worked their way through the corridors of Nexus Central at a pace the station's residents began to notice and comment on. Not loudly, not disruptively, just with the specific presence of people who know what they're doing and have found things to do. A permanent resident of Deck 17, a mid-tier merchant named Hesk Avathar, posted a note on the station's internal forums, stating that the lighting in the East Corridor had worked flawlessly for 2 consecutive days for the first time in 8 months, asking who had fixed it and if he could thank them in person. Mia Walker saw the note and forwarded it to Pendleton, who replied that the merchant could just say hi if he saw them in the hall. That was enough. The 6th day of the session brought the formal vote. Vex Aren stared at the voting panel with the full attention of her 4 eyes, each focusing on a different angle of the room to capture maximum visual data. It was a reflex of her species during moments of high importance, a form of parallel processing her ancestors had developed in environments with multiple predators, which she had discovered worked equally well in deliberation chambers. The result was 22 votes in favor of revocation, 4 abstentions, and 0 against. Councillor Vrathnum had abstained, not voted against. It was a distinction Sela noticed immediately, describing it to Vex Arin in a low voice as the difference between disagreement and non-obstruction, which, in a council of 26 votes, was sometimes the most important thing someone could offer. Magistrate Torvan Sek announced the result with the solemnity the occasion deserved, and with a brevity that surprised everyone in the room. Isolation Directive H001 was revoked, effective immediately. Official navigation maps would be updated. A transition commission would be formed to coordinate the next steps. At the human delegations table, Dr. Hayes nodded her head once, bearing the restrained expression of someone who had learned over many years of negotiations that celebrating before leaving the room was premature. Commander Sterling was smiling in a way Vex Arin now recognized as the specific smile of someone who had waited for something and was genuinely pleased to see it happen. Not triumphant, just satisfied. Mia Walker's eyes were glued to her terminal, already processing data for the Transition Commission. Sela Morwen Dath was staring at the central screen, where the official galactic map had been opened in edit mode for the first time in 800 years. A cursor blinked over the gray area in the western arm, waiting for the update that would finally erase the deliberate void that had sat there since before anyone in the room was born. Vex Arin looked at Sela. The veteran diplomat's eyes were damp, which, for the Dath Sorin, was a rare and involuntary physiological sign associated with processing highly emotional events. She wasn't trying to hide it. "It took a while," Vex Arin said. Sela nodded. "It always does," she said. "The question is whether it happens at all." On the central screen, the cursor blinked one last time, and the gray stain began to disappear. Part 6. New Frontiers. 6 months after the revocation of Directive H001, Vex Arin's office at Nexus Central had a window overlooking the outer docking ring, and she had learned to identify human ships by sound before seeing them. It wasn't a matter of propulsion technology. Although human warp engines had a slightly different frequency signature than standard galactic models, different enough that traffic control techs had created a custom category for them in the ID systems. It was more a matter of behavior. Human ships tended to request docking clearance with less lead time than protocol recommended, not out of disrespect, but because their navigation computers calculated approach windows with a margin of confidence that local controllers took a few weeks to realize was simply different, not incorrect. And they tended to arrive loaded, not necessarily with cargo, though there was definitely trade, loaded with people, with tools, with questions, with the specific energy of individuals who had realized there was a lot to do and were genuinely eager to get started. Vex Arin had been promoted to Senior Researcher First Class, the highest designation the Galactic Administration awarded to academics without a diplomatic title. She had been assigned to the Cultural Integration Commission, the formal name given to the group responsible for managing a transition everyone knew had begun, but nobody had properly managed to forecast. None of the modeling had been sufficient. Economists had projected a gradual adaptation period of 10 to 15 years before the human presence became a significant variable in galactic trade and infrastructure flows. What actually happened, within 6 months, was that the models had to be thrown out. Not because humans arrived with firepower or demands or any of the strategies Councillor Vrathnum had cited during his cautious abstention. They arrived with exactly what Dr. Hayes had described during the review session: work and interesting problems to solve. And combining those two things with a galaxy that had accumulated a considerable backlog of unresolved problems over the centuries, produced an acceleration that no integration model had adequately captured. The Helios Gamma Station Restoration Project was the most frequently cited example. Helios Gamma was a research station in an unstable orbit around a binary system, operating in reduced capacity mode for 80 years, because the cost of stabilizing the orbit exceeded any benefit calculation the responsible committees could justify. It was the kind of problem that had existed long enough to acquire the quality of permanence, appearing on periodic reports as a monitored situation and remaining that way for decades, because monitored was a category that required no action. Engineer Pendleton had seen the Helios Gamma report during a routine Integration Commission meeting and asked, with genuine curiosity, why no one had tried the dynamic orbital counterweight approach. He described it in 3 sentences. The station's chief engineer, consulted remotely, confirmed it had never been considered because it wasn't a technique found in standard administration orbital engineering manuals. 4 months later, Helios Gamma was in a stable orbit and had resumed full operations for the first time in 8 decades. The technique was documented, informally named the Pendleton method by local technicians, and was currently being applied in 14 other systems with similar orbital issues. It was this pattern Vex Arin had spent the last few months documenting. Not grand gestures, not dramatic interventions, but a constant accumulation of solved problems, of new techniques applied to old contexts, of questions asked about things everyone else had stopped questioning because they'd been around long enough to feel inevitable. There were other patterns, too, the ones harder to document but equally present. The crew of the merchant ship Celestial Drifter, rescued after engine failure, 12 hours off any regular traffic lane, by a human exploration vessel that detected the distress signal and diverted course without a single question about compensation or protocol. The Keth Federation reconnaissance drone, lost for 2 years in a high-density dust region, showing up at the nearest Federation station with a note attached, saying it had been found on a routine survey and returned because it looked like it belonged to someone. And the crate of medical supplies that arrived at the mining colony of Tarsus 7, with no invoice, no identified origin, just a note saying they had seen the shortage report on the open navigation logs and hoped it helped. Vex Arin had tracked the Tarsus 7 crate to a human supply ship that had passed through the system 6 weeks prior. She contacted the ship's operator to confirm. The reply came in 3 days. Yeah, that was us. We had plenty. Wasn't a problem. This was the pattern she had tried to describe in her reports to the Commission with only partial success, because there was something in the quality of those actions that resisted analytical language. They weren't strategic. They weren't performative. They were simply what happened when people with the capacity to solve a problem encountered a problem that needed solving, and when the internal cost-benefit calculation guiding their decision automatically included the heavy toll of leaving a problem unsolved when a solution was right there. Sella had described it once, in one of the long conversations the two continued to have regularly, as the difference between an ethic of contingent responsibility and an ethic of constitutive responsibility. The galaxy at large operated on the former. Responsibility existed when there was a contract, an established relationship, a calculable benefit. Humans seemed to operate on the latter. Responsibility existed simply because the problem existed, and they had the capacity to address it. Vex Arin had asked if that didn't make humanity perpetually overburdened. Sella replied that this was exactly the right question, and the answer she'd arrived at, over months of observation, was, sometimes yes, and that humans had developed, throughout their history, a considerable array of cultural mechanisms to handle burnout, to distribute responsibility. To say no when saying yes was no longer sustainable. But the baseline pattern remained. It was a civilization that had learned to survive in harsh conditions and had internalized, on some level Sella couldn't pinpoint precisely in history or biology, that harsh conditions were more manageable collectively than individually. And for them, collectively, possessed a considerably wider radius than for most species the galaxy had ever catalogued. On the morning of the 187th day following the directive's revocation, a package arrived at Vex Arin's office with an external note that read simply, "To the researcher who found the file. With respect." Inside was a map. Not a digital file, not a holographic projection, but a map printed on physical material. The kind of high-resolution print still used for documents meant to last, detailing the coordinates of the western arm of the galaxy to scale. The 237 systems of human space were marked with precision, with names, with resource data, with the navigation routes the persistent horizon and the ships that followed had established over the past few months. There were no more gray areas. Where the stain had been, there were stars. There were systems. There was tangible evidence of a civilization that had been present the entire time. In the lower right corner of the map, handwritten with a permanent ink pen in the uneven script of someone more accustomed to typing than writing, was a note. Vex Arin immediately recognized it as Commander Sterling's, having seen his handwriting on docking forms during the week of the review session. It said, "Nice work on the map. Took a while, but you did it." She stared at those words for a considerable amount of time. There was something in them that captured, in a way all her analytical reports hadn't quite managed, what was essential about the last 6 months. Not the diplomacy, not the treaties, not the infrastructure projects or the trade routes or the integration commissions. Just the simple, direct acknowledgement that there had been a job to do, and it had been done. And that was enough to warrant a note. She hung the map on her office wall, right next to the window overlooking the docking ring. That same day, a human ship docked at Airlock 12, carrying a team of engineers responding to an open request for technical assistance from the colony of Veth Soran. The request had been posted 6 years ago. It had received 62 commitments to respond and 0 actual visits, because the Veth Soran system sat on an inconvenient route and the detour costs were hard to justify. The human engineers had seen the open request on a database of unresolved projects the Integration Commission had compiled as part of its transparency protocols and decided it was worth the detour. They hadn't given advanced notice. They just arrived and asked where they needed to go. Vex Arin knew this because the traffic controller who processed the docking had sent a routine report, and because Mia Walker, who now worked at the Commission full-time, had flagged the report with a note that said simply, "Here's another one." It was the 93rd log of its kind since the directive was revoked. That afternoon, sitting in her office with the map on the wall to her left and the window to the docking ring to her right, Vex Arin began to write the final chapter of her doctoral thesis, which had been redirected, with the Academic Council's approval, from digital archaeology to applied contemporary history. The chapter was simply titled, "What Happens When You Stop Pretending Something Doesn't Exist?" She had imagined, when she started writing, that she would need many pages to answer that question. Over the months, she had discovered the answer was simpler than she had anticipated. What happens is that the thing you were pretending didn't exist continues to be what it always was. And if what it always was included the capacity to fix water filtration systems without being asked, to return lost drones with polite notes, to detour off-route to answer 6-year-old requests, and to send medical supplies without invoices or the expectation of thanks, then what happens when you stop pretending is that you finally gain access to all of it. It was a conclusion that seemed simple once written down, and that had taken 800 years to arrive. From the docking ring, through the window, came the characteristic sound of a human ship completing its seal on the airlock. Vex Arin didn't need to check the identification system. She already knew what it was. She returned to the text and kept writing. End of story. If the human crew's tenacity inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles of the galactic frontier. The galaxy is vast, the problems are many, And there is always someone arriving unannounced, tools in hand, asking where they need to go.